So you wanted to take a closer look at the long-term effects of major storms like Hurricane Helene. And it's true, the news always focuses on that immediate devastation, right? But we wanted to go deeper than that. We're going to explore how these events can impact communities for over a decade in some really unexpected ways.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
How we tend to zero in on the immediate aftermath, all that visible destruction, the displacement.
Right.
But it's those ripple effects, the ones that impact people's health and well-being.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that can quietly linger for years.
Absolutely. And this new Stanford study was published in Nature. That's what really kind of blew my mind. They've been looking at the impact of major storms all the way back to 1930.
Wow.
And what they discovered about the long-term death toll, it's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it really makes you stop and think. This study, it estimates that for every single major storm, there are between 7,000 to 11,000 excess deaths in the years that follow.
Wow.
That's not even from the storm itself, but from what comes after. Those aftershocks, what we call cascading consequences.
Okay, so let's break down those cascading consequences, because I think for a lot of us, that's where things get really, really interesting. The study, it points to several factors, right?
Absolutely,
Like,
yeah.
what are we talking about here?
Well, a major one is simply financial strain.
Okay.
Just think about it for a second. Rebuilding, it just wipes out savings.
Right.
For individuals, for whole communities, and that often means there's a lot less money available for things like healthcare in the years that follow. Imagine having to choose between, fixing your roof or paying for medication. It's a heartbreaking reality for so many people.
Yeah, it's easy to overlook that long-term financial burden when you're just thinking about that immediate crisis. But like you said, those costs, they just keep adding up.
And it goes beyond just, finances. These storms, they disrupt entire social networks.
Right.
Think about it. People are displaced. Communities are scattered.
Right.
Those crucial support systems that we rely on for our well-being, they're significantly weakened. And we know how damaging things like social isolation and lack of support can be for anyone's health.
It's like this double whammy, right?
Exactly.
You have the financial hardship and then the weakened support system. That can't be good for anyone, especially those who are already more vulnerable.
And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. You see, governments often have to make these really, really tough calls about where their resources are going to go, right?
Right.
After a storm of this magnitude, the priority shifts to immediate recovery, and understandably so. Clearing debris, rebuilding infrastructure, getting people into shelters.
Right.
But sometimes those efforts can come at the cost of long-term healthcare investments. And while those investments might not seem as pressing at the time, the moment, they definitely have ripple effects down the line.
So we're talking about potential gaps in healthcare access, fewer resources for preventative care.
Right, exactly.
It's a lot to think about. It feels like a domino effect.
It really underscores that the true cost of these events, it's so much bigger than just that initial damage we see. And for me, it really emphasizes just how important a more holistic approach to recovery needs to be.
Okay.
One that bakes in those long-term health consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that really jumped out to me in the study was how certain groups are impacted even more severely. I think we all know that storms are dangerous, but the impact on infants and young children, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, and that's something that often gets overlooked. The study actually found that a full quarter of infant deaths
Wow.
and 15% of deaths in people under 45 are connected to the aftermath of these major storms.
Yeah.
And here's the really tough part. Many of these kids weren't even alive when the storm hit.
I know. That's what I found just astounding. It's not just about the immediate danger, but it's those ripples that impact families and their health for years, even if they weren't even there when the storm happened. What explains that?
Well, it goes back to those enduring impacts on families and the communities around them. Think about mothers, for example, right?
Right.
They might be dealing with these long-term economic struggles or health issues as a direct result of what that storm did.
Right.
And naturally, that's going to impact their children's well-being years down the line. It really emphasizes how it's not enough to just fix the physical damage.
Right.
We have to address those social and economic consequences too, especially for families who are already in a vulnerable position.
It really makes you see how the storm is like this catalyst
Right.
that sets off this whole chain reaction of consequences.
Precisely. And, unfortunately, just like with so many other things, these impacts, they aren't felt equally across the board.
Right.
The study found some pretty startling racial disparities when it comes to those long-term mortality rates after a storm.
Right, that's something we see again and again in these types of situations.
Exactly.
The most vulnerable often bear the brunt of it and take the longest to recover. So, what did this study actually show about those disparities?
Well, the numbers are pretty stark. Black Americans face triple, yes, you heard that right, triple the risk of death in the months and years after a hurricane compared to white Americans.
Wow.
And it really underscores, the deeply rooted disadvantages that exist, the ones that make certain communities just inherently more vulnerable,
Right.
not only to the immediate impact of these events, but to the long-term consequences as well.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder that these storms, they don't create inequalities, but they certainly expose them.
They do.
And they often exacerbate them. It makes you wonder, are those disparities actually being factored into disaster planning and resource allocation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the study itself suggests that often the answer is no.
Really?
For instance, it found that areas that actually haven't had a ton of experience with these major storms, they actually end up experiencing a much bigger impact on long-term mortality.
Now, that's counterintuitive.
Right.
You would think that those places that are hit more often would be more prepared, and therefore would bounce back more quickly and effectively in the long run, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But what the study suggests is that this lack of firsthand experience, this lack of having gone through these truly extreme events, can actually lead to, well, a lack of preparedness, both on the individual family level and then also for the community as a whole. It's kind of like that old saying, out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
If you haven't personally lived through the long-term devastation of a storm, it's going to be much harder to really grasp those risks and put them front and center in your planning.
So it's about more than just having stronger buildings, or efficient evacuation plans.
Sure.
It's about a deeper understanding of those long-term risks and adapting our communities and support systems in a way that acknowledges and addresses those.
I think that's exactly right. And this is where, we can't really avoid talking about climate change and how it plays into this entire equation.
Because climate change, it's only expected to exacerbate this issue, right?
Yeah.
Make these storms more frequent, more intense, potentially shift their usual paths,
Exactly.
putting communities at risk that have never had to deal with this before.
You've got it.
Yeah.
As climate change continues to, throw a wrench in our weather patterns, we can pretty much guarantee that we're going to see more of these extreme weather events.
Right.
We're talking stronger hurricanes, we're talking bigger storms, and they're going to happen more frequently and in places that might be completely caught off guard.
Yeah.
Understanding those long-term consequences, like this study highlights, it's not just an interesting thing to know anymore.
Right.
It's crucial for actually building communities that can weather these storms, literally and figuratively, in this changing world.
So knowing all of this, knowing that a storm's impact can reverberate for over a decade, that it can have these ripple effects, and that it disproportionately affects the most vulnerable among us, what can we do? What's the takeaway here? Does the study offer any kind of solutions or paths forward?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom. There is a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
The study does offer a few potential solutions, although they would require a pretty significant shift in how we think about preparing for and recovering from these disasters.
I'm all ears. What kind of shifts are we talking about here?
And the researchers really put a strong emphasis on the importance of what they call proactive planning.
Okay.
And that goes for individuals, but it also goes for communities as a whole. So let's say you're a family living in an area that's prone to, let's say, hurricanes. Proactive planning might mean putting some resources aside, not just for the immediate repairs after a storm hits, but also for those unforeseen healthcare costs that could pop up down the line.
Right.
Think of it as building a little financial cushion
Right.
to help you weather those long-term impacts.
So being financially prepared for the long haul, what about on a larger scale? What can communities do to be more proactive? So we're talking about a more proactive approach to preparing for these events, but on a community-wide scale. What does that look like?
Well, for governments and communities, it's about acknowledging that these events have these long-term health consequences, right? And then reflecting that in how they allocate resources.
Okay.
So that could mean, investing in more robust public health infrastructure.
Making sure those social safety nets are stronger.
Right.
Or even developing, really targeted support systems, especially for those communities that we already know are most vulnerable. It's about, moving away from just reacting to disasters as they happen,
Right.
and instead embracing a more proactive and comprehensive strategy,
Okay.
one that prioritizes long-term well-being alongside that immediate recovery.
So shifting from crisis mode to resilience mode, basically.
Exactly.
And it sounds like a really critical part of that is actually addressing those disparities that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. The study really underscores how important it is to really recognize and address the fact that these events have a disproportionate impact on, marginalized communities.
Right.
And that means ensuring equal access to healthcare, housing, economic opportunities. Right.
And not just, before a disaster hits, but also in those critical months and years afterwards.
Right.
It's about, trying to create a more just and equitable society overall.
Right.
One that's better equipped to face these storms, both literally and figuratively.
It's about understanding that resilience isn't just about bouncing back, but bouncing back stronger
Yes,
and more equitably.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It really is about recognizing that the true cost of these storms goes way beyond just that initial damage. And investing in long-term resilience.
Yeah.
It's not just about saving lives in the moment.
Right.
It's about creating a more just and equitable future for absolutely everyone.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder.
I like it. Give them something to think about,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. We've spent this whole deep dive talking about the hidden toll of storms, those long-term consequences that we don't always hear about. But as we've learned, there are steps we can take
Right.
to mitigate those risks and build more resilient communities. So here's my question for everyone listening. As we rebuild after storms, how can we ensure that we're not just rebuilding what was lost, but that we're actually creating a better, more equitable future for everyone? It's about taking what we've learned from the past and using it to build a brighter future, one storm at a time.